Hello. Watching last week's class and my and Sarah's critique was helpful in how I might approach developing this book layout. I really did have so many rectangles and I didn't even realize it. But when it came to part 3 of this assignment, translate step 2 into a primarily photographic language, I was completely lost. I mulled over the feedback for a few days, and finally, on Sunday, I thought of a concept inspired by Rosie's diorama from last week. I had no idea if it would work, but at the very least, I would push myself and approach this last step with a true sense of whimsy and play. I started by silhouetting the library I was working with last week. Easy enough. I then identified other elements I was working with, historical images and the flagpole, and began cutting them out of paper. I then began to set up my scene. I tried a technique I used in my thesis, which involves using a digital screen as my background. In this example, it's my iPad. Working like this allowed me to add elements in 3D and then update them back to 2D before adding more elements in 3D. Hopefully that makes sense, but I'll narrate each step. So again, the original image on my iPad. I then added 2 historical images, both taped with Rubylith because that's what I had close by. Next, I add in the flagpole. Then I photographed the image. Next, I began to add in text. I cut out the letters for museum and used thread and tape to work them into the piece. Again, the scene photographed. At this point, I decided to translate what I had captured so far back to 2D, so I imported the image and then updated the photo on the iPad. I wanted to photograph both the physical text over the digital background, as you see here, as well as photograph the physical text over the photograph containing the text, which we're looking at here. I decided to move forward with this image as I liked the texture the multiple sets of characters offered. At this point, I was beginning to have fun with this exercise. As I worked and translated these images between 2D and 3D, I began to see opportunity in different spaces, options for how I might incorporate text, both digital and physical. I also recognize, though, that the text up until this point has been very unstructured, cut out by hand and taped onto string. Working this way was helpful for me in getting started on this process. But when I think of libraries or museums, I think of very structured organizations with multiple systems in place to convey information. I wanted to see how adding in familiar methods of type, labels or captions, would change the composition. Here I added my first digital text in the form of captions. Very simple, each identifying an image. Next, I add in the map I created last week. I did edit it to include some highway markers and the state, but most of that information gets lost in the overlay. At this point, I realized that, despite multiple layers of information, there is a clear hierarchy in this image. The more translating the image between 2D and 3D, the farther back the original image of the library becomes. It makes me question the way I'm working. Should I have been more structured with my information at the beginning? Developed a better system? I decided to commit to finishing this experiment and then evaluate what worked and what didn't at the end. I decided to add 2 more layers of text, both physical, one printed on paper and one printed on transparency. Here I added boxes of factual-based text. I recognize I should have been more careful about placement, but I did appreciate how legible the text was. which was my main goal, after I photographed it. This image tried to add a layer of narrative text on transparency in front of the previous text. I did not care for this result as it made both sets of text, narrative and factual, illegible. So, taking one step back, I'm calling this my final image for the week. The idea of this way of working, translating between physical and digital, was easier for me because I was able to slow down again, reacting to one layer at a time. Unsurprisingly, this week's work has also suggested more possibilities and questions I'd like to explore. For example, do I create a system for the different levels of information, say factual versus personal narrative, and assign them to specific physical or digital layers? Could the depth of field suggest a timeline? Should I have started with an image of this library from 1912 and worked my way to the present? Was the hand-cut text out of place? At the beginning, it was a way for me to work directly on the image without a background, but the character of the letter forms when tied to the string felt loose and playful compared to the topic that I was discussing. How would the image have been different if I'd focused more on the scene and cropped out the iPad frame? Or does the iPad frame add an additional layer of meaning, as it is a modern way of looking up references? As always, thank you for any suggestions or feedback.